to Baking Basics for Teens. My name is Sam. I'm the teen librarian at Bay County Public Library. I got a lot of my information from a book called How to Bake Everything by Mark Bittman, which is available for checkout in the Northwest Regional Library System. We also have other cookbooks you can check out. Just go to our website at www.nwrls.com and search using the catalog. Use your library card number and your PIN to place holds. Okay, so I'm going to talk about ingredients first. So we're going to go over some basics, and then I'll show you how to make sugar cookies with the recipe I got from How to Bake Everything. So let's start with the ingredients. Some of the main ingredients of baking are typically flour, sugar, butter, and eggs. I will talk about some other ingredients as well. Of course, if you want something to be vegan or gluten-free, you have to substitute other ingredients instead, and How to Bake Everything actually lists some of these substitutes. So let's talk about flour. There are different kinds of flour. When using white flour, which is probably the flour you're used to, try to use unbleached flour, which doesn't have the chemicals that bleached flour does. Unbleached flour is still white. All-purpose flour is a good flour to use. It's called all-purpose for a reason, and that's what I'm going to be using in my sugar cookie recipe. So let's talk about sugar. There are different kinds of sugars and sweeteners, including granulated and liquid. So granulated sugars usually include white sugar and brown sugar. Liquid sweeteners can include honey, molasses, maple syrup, and so forth. In our cookie recipe, we'll be using regular white granulated sugar, but other types of white sugar include confectioner's sugar and superfine sugar. Okay, let's talk about butter. Fat is important in baking. It adds both flavor and tenderness. Unsalted butter, sticks of butter, is better to have because you can always add salt. If you buy salted butter, don't add salt if the recipe calls for it. Recipes usually call for the butter to be at certain temperatures. Melted means it's been turned into a liquid. Softened means room temperature, so that when you touch it, it leaves a slight fingerprint. And then cold means right out of the fridge. Let's talk about eggs. So eggs help to bind a recipe together or give it structure. They also help to leaven it or help it to rise, and they give tenderness or flavor to the recipe. When buying eggs at the grocery store, make sure to open the carton and make sure they aren't broken, and check their expiration date as well. Okay, let's talk about leavening. Ingredients that leaven your recipe or help it to rise include baking soda, baking powder, yeast, and so forth. Okay. Let's talk about extracts and flavor. Extracts add flavor to your recipe. Try to stick with extracts as opposed to items labeled as flavorings, because those are often synthetic and don't have as much flavor as extracts do. So one of the most popular extracts is vanilla extract. For this recipe, that's what we'll be using. Make sure it's labeled as pure vanilla extract, which has the best flavor. There's other ways you can add flavor as well. Almond extract, peppermint extract, and some people will even use tea or coffee to add flavor to baking. And before we get started, let's talk about food safety. So make sure you keep your hands clean. You need to wash all surfaces before food touches them and after food touches them as well. Soap and hot water are best for cleaning. Do not use cleaning products. Wash your hands after handling raw egg, which often contains illnesses such as salmonella. Wash fruits or vegetables before using them. Some recipes do call for them. Keep cold foods such as eggs, butter, and meat refrigerated. And also know that some baked goods are meant to be refrigerated, so check to be certain. So now we're going to learn an easy sugar cookie recipe. Follow along to learn how to make these cookies and some other basics of baking, such as techniques and kitchen tools. Make sure you pay attention to what ingredients and how much, because baking is a science. It's like doing a chemistry experiment, and we have to be exact for the cookies to come out right. Okay, let's get started on those sugar cookies. But first, before we go over what ingredients we're going to need, it is really important that you wash your hands with soap and water. Always keep your hands clean when you're cooking. Also, take off any jewelry you may have. Okay, let's go over the ingredients. We're going to need 2 sticks of butter softened. So, 1 stick of butter is about half a cup. Softened means that it needs to be room temperature and a little bit soft. So, all you have to do is set your butter out on a plate, and then when it gets to where you can push your finger into it just a little bit and leave a fingerprint, that's how you want your butter to be softened. So 2 sticks of softened butter, 2 cups of granulated sugar, 1 egg, 2 teaspoons of vanilla extract, 2 3/4 cups of flour, 1 teaspoon of baking soda, and half a teaspoon of salt. Let's get started. Okay, let's start with the butter. We're going to put the butter in a large bowl, and we're going to need a fork. Now, what we're going to be doing is something called creaming. It's a term called creaming. What this does is it creates air pockets that steam up during baking, which makes your cookies light and tender. So, when you're doing this, you can use a hand mixer, a standing mixer, or you can do it by hand. I'm going to be mixing by hand using a fork. Okay, so first, to cream the butter, I'm going to mash it up pretty good. Now if you've got a mixer at home, it does make it easier, but if you don't, this is how you can do it. Okay, it's getting pretty fluffy. Let's add in our sugar. So, we're going to combine the butter and the sugar together, creaming it all together. Okay, so we need 2 cups of granulated sugar. So, I'm going to take this measuring cup. This is granulated sugar. Now, this is a half measuring cup, because it can't fit, a whole cup can't fit in my jar here. So what I'm going to do is, since I need 2 cups of granulated sugar, that's going to be 4 of these. So we're going to scoop it. And what you want to do is always make your ingredient even with the top of your measuring cup. So 1, 2, 3, and 4. That was 2 cups of granulated sugar. Okay, now I'm going to stir that in with the butter, just creaming it. See how the butter and the sugar are starting to come together into a lump all together, becoming one substance. Get some of that off your fork. It is messy. Make sure your hands are clean. And always make sure you wash your hands in between different ingredients. And if you've got a hand mixer at home or a stand mixer, you might want to ask your parents for help in using it. But you can use that too. It makes your job easier. You don't want to stir too much. You want it just until it's well blended. Okay? Now, I'm going to use my plate to put my fork. So this is where we are going to add in the egg and the vanilla. We're going to need 1 egg. So you can do this a couple ways. You can crack the egg in a different bowl and pour it in, or you can try cracking the egg on the side of your bowl. Alright? Now be careful not to get the egg all over the place, so just take the egg and hold it like this. Okay, and just kind of gently hit it on the side. Try not to get shell into your cookies. If you do, you can easily just pick it out. I see a little bit there. This is the important part. I'm going to go wash my hands right now because eggs can carry salmonella and I don't want eggs on my hand. Okay, so I went and washed my hands. So now let's keep going. Now we're going to add in 2 teaspoons of vanilla extract. Okay. So this is a teaspoon, so I'm going to do 2 of these. Here's my vanilla extract. Now again, we want it to be even. So this is 1 and 2. Now, we're going to stir this all together until it's light and fluffy. See how it's starting to really turn into one substance? You want it to be well mixed. Look under the dough here, that's starting to form. It's not quite dough yet, but look under it. Make sure there's no egg. Okay, let's talk about dry ingredients. So in a separate bowl, we're going to mix some of our dry ingredients. Okay, so let's start with the flour. Again, this is all-purpose flour. 2 3/4 cups of flour. So, this is 1 cup dry measuring spoon. So I'm going to do 2 of these. Okay, again, you want it to be even with the top. So 1. Again, even with the top. It's important in baking to get our ingredients exact. It's like a science. So, that was 2 cups. So now we're going to do 3/4 of a cup. So, this is a 1/4 cup measuring spoon. So I'm going to do 3 of these. Again, get it even. I kind of like to use the bag to even it out. 1, 2, and 3. So that was 2 3/4 cups of flour. And we're going to add in our baking soda. So this is baking soda. And we're going to do 1 teaspoon of baking soda. So this is 1 teaspoon. Again, we want it to be even. So 1 teaspoon. And we're going to do 1/2 teaspoon of salt. Now here's the thing. The butter that I put into these cookies is unsalted butter. If you'd use salted butter, you probably wouldn't have to do the salt step, okay? But typically you want to use unsalted butter when baking. So we got our salt here, and this is a 1/2 teaspoon. So 1/2 teaspoon of salt. Be real careful. Half a teaspoon of salt. Alright, so now what we're going to do is we're going to what's called whisk the dry ingredients together. So we're going to need a tool called a whisk. And we're just going to stir. The whisk really mixes these together very well. So. We're going to be adding the dry ingredients to the wet ingredients. So what I'm going to use for this is called a rubber spatula. That's what this is. And we're going to be doing something called folding. We're going to fold the dry ingredients into the wet ingredients. So basically, picture like folding paper or folding a blanket. You're folding it, turning it into the wet ingredients, a little bit by little bit. Okay, so we're going to do a little bit. Let's do a little bit at a time. Because it's going to be forming sort of a sandy looking dough. Because this is going to be your final dough when we're done. That's going to turn into cookies. Okay, just add a little bit at a time. Again, if you have a mixer, this is much easier, but we're just kind of rolling it into the dough, as you can see. Now at this point, I could probably start using my hands to squish it together, okay? So let's put that to the side. But again, make sure your hands are clean, especially after handling egg or anything like that. See how it's kind of starting to form a dough? Just get your hands in there real good. You want everything to be mixed up really nice. See, it's starting to stick together. we're going to form, again, this is a cookie that goes in the fridge as a dough for a little while. So we're going to take our dough and we're going to form them into logs. And then we're going to wrap them up and put them in the fridge for 2 hours. Okay? 2 hours. But first, I gotta turn them into logs. So, I'm going to take a plate. And I've got some more flour. Because the flour, I'm going to put some loose flour on the plate and on my hands. Because that will keep it from the dough from sticking to everything when I try to make a log. Okay, so I'm just going to do a little bit of flour on my plate here. And I'm going to kind of rub my hands in some of the flour. Again, make sure your hands are clean. All surfaces need to be clean when cooking. I'm going to take some dough. You can always add more. See how it's formed a nice dough? Do a little bit more. See, I'm kneading it together. I'm forming one big lump of dough. Okay, so now we're gonna sort of roll it. Now you could actually, you don't need a rolling pin for this. I was going to say you could use a rolling pin, but you don't need a rolling pin for this because you're not flattening it. So let's just use our hands. And we're just kind of making a log. Now, how big your log is determines how big your cookies are going to be, because when you get it out of the fridge, we're going to cut this into slices, cookie-shaped slices. Okay, so you know, if you want really tiny cookies, you're going to make a really skinny log. If you want bigger cookies, this is going to be a fatter log. Okay? And really, this right here is pretty good. I'm trying to make some decent sized cookies. So, kind of try to make it even too. Make it even. Okay, now, normally, you could wrap this in plastic wrap. I am going to use a bag, a sandwich bag, or this is actually a freezer bag, and wrap it up in. So you can use these if you don't happen to have plastic wrap. Okay, so I'm just going to place this in it. Okay, kind of get the air out of it. You can kind of see how I'm rolling it to get the air out. Okay, you can use smaller sandwich bags than this if you want, plastic bags. Okay, I'm just going to zip this up. Okay, now I have a log. And I'm going to do that to all of this dough. And we're going to put it in the fridge for 2 hours. Now, about 30 minutes before you get it out of the fridge, we're going to turn on the oven. It's called preheating the oven. That way, it takes a while for the oven to heat up. So that way it saves you a little bit of time. So we're going to preheat the oven to 375 degrees Fahrenheit. Okay? 375 degrees Fahrenheit. I'm going to give you a little tip to actually save on plastic. Okay? So I did roll one up before all the way into the bag like that. But there's another way you can roll these logs into the bag. Okay, so I'm going to do one little roll. Okay, I'm going to take another log and place it here. That way I can just keep rolling so the logs are not sticking together, and that saves on plastic. So our dough has sat for 2 hours. About an hour and a half in, we turned on the oven to get it started, and now it is at 375 degrees, which is what we want. We have a cutting board with one of our dough logs and a knife, and this is a bowl of sugar, the same sugar we used before. And what we're going to do is cut these up, and we're going to dunk them in sugar, okay? But before we do that, let's talk about what we're going to be baking on. So this is a cookie sheet. I put aluminum foil, but you can also use parchment paper or one of those non-stick silicone mats. I greased it with some olive oil cooking spray. You can use butter. I like to grease it so the cookies don't stick to it. So let's go ahead and start cutting. I'm just going to cut these cookies into chunks. Okay, that's good there. So what we're going to do is take our cookie sheet. If you got room, you can just lay down the cookie sheet. And we're going to dunk the cookies all in sugar. Okay. Now you want to space the cookies just a little bit apart, because when they spread out, you don't want them to form one big cookie, because if they're too close, they'll cook together. Okay. Alright, and you're going to go all the way down the cookie sheet, and you may have to fill up another cookie sheet too, because this makes quite a bit of dough. Alright, so what we're going to end up doing is placing the cookie sheets in the oven for about, let's see what the cookbook says, 6 to 8 minutes. So, but something you want to do about halfway through that 6 to 8 minutes, so about maybe 3 minutes in, if your oven is anything like mine, I have a top rack and a bottom rack. Well, if I have 2 cookie sheets, they're only going to fit one on the top rack and one on the bottom rack. So about halfway through, you'll want to switch them out, because the one on the bottom will be too crispy if it stays there the whole time, and the one on top will be too soft. So we're going to cook, again, 6 to 8 minutes. Keep an eye on them. You want them to be sort of golden brown around the edges, but still soft. You don't want it to turn into a really hard cookie or a burnt cookie. Okay, so our cookies are done. Make sure to take them out of the oven with an oven mitt. You don't want to burn yourself. Alright, so here's a trick to see if your cookies are actually done. So this is a toothpick. Take your toothpick, stick it down in the middle of a cookie. You can do this with cake too. Alright, if your toothpick is pretty clean, there's not a whole lot of wet dough sticking to it, that means that your cookies are done. If there was like a bunch of dough sticking to this toothpick, it would mean that the cookies are still wet inside and need to cook longer. Okay, so these cookies have been cooling down for a little bit. I have a spatula, and what I'm going to do is I'm going to remove the cookies and place them on a plate for further cooling. Now some people use a cooling rack, but for cookies I just like to use a plate. Either way. Now these cookies can be stored in an airtight container at room temperature. A lot of cookies can, but some cookies might need refrigerating. Say if you put cream cheese frosting on them or something like that, okay? Well, I still have more cookie dough, so I'm going to keep baking. But thank you for joining us for this video, and Merry Christmas and Happy Holidays!